They came for Bumpy Johnson at night, not with noise, not with sirens. They came quietly, the way federal agents always do when they think they already won. The FBI had been watching him for months. Phones, streets, informants. They believed this time was different. Bumpy was supposed to be alone. No bodyguards, no exits, no mistakes. The arrest team was ready, papers signed, cars in position. One signal, and it was over. But something felt wrong. Before the agents moved in, a New York City police car slowly rolled past the building. Then another one, then a third. That was not part of the plan. The FBI noticed it immediately. Local police were not supposed to be there. Not tonight, not on this operation. One of the agents asked a simple question. Why are NYPD units circling the target? No one answered. Inside the building, Bumpy Johnson was sitting calmly, not hiding, not packing, not running, because Bumpy already knew. He knew the hour, he knew the address, and most important, he knew who was coming. What the FBI didn't know was this. The police had known for days. They had the same information, the same names, the same time window. But while the FBI prepared an arrest, the NYPD made a different decision. Outside, the federal agents waited for the signal. Minutes passed. Then, a police captain stepped out of his car and walked straight toward the FBI team. He didn't whisper. He didn't hesitate. He said calmly, "This operation stops here." The agents thought it was a joke. They showed their badges, their warrants, their authority. The captain didn't look impressed. "You arrest him tonight," he said, "and this neighborhood explodes by morning." The FBI pushed back. They said law was law, that no one was above it. The captain answered with one sentence that changed everything. "You don't live here, we do." What the FBI didn't understand yet was simple. This was not about protecting a criminal. It was about preventing a war. Because if Bumpy Johnson was taken by federal hands, the streets would not stay quiet. Rivals would move in, old debts would surface, scores would be settled, and the first people caught in the middle would be the police themselves. The FBI looked around. Uniforms everywhere, patrol cars blocking streets that were supposed to stay clear. Slowly, the agents realized something shocking. They were outnumbered, not by criminals, by the city. And while they argued outside, Bumpy Johnson sat inside untouched, listening to the clock tick. Because this night was never about arresting him. It was about deciding who really controlled Harlem, and the FBI was about to learn the answer. The FBI agents stayed in position longer than planned. Radios whispered short codes, engines idled. The street should have been quiet, but it wasn't. New York City police units kept arriving one by one, slow and deliberate, blocking corners that were never meant to be blocked. This was not interference by mistake. It was control. The federal team felt it immediately, not as open resistance but as pressure, the kind that doesn't shout but makes it clear who owns the ground. For the FBI, Bumpy Johnson was a case, a file, a target with a long history and enough evidence to justify an arrest. For the NYPD, he was something else. He was a fixed point in a dangerous system. Harlem under Bumpy was violent, but predictable, loud but organized, illegal but contained, and containment was everything. The police captain understood this better than anyone on that street. He had watched what happened when power disappeared overnight. He had seen gangs rush to fill the vacuum, old enemies resurface, shootings multiply, and civilians get caught in crossfire that had nothing to do with them. Every time order collapsed, the same people paid the price. Patrol officers, medics, shop owners, families who never chose sides. That was why he spoke calmly, not to challenge authority, but to explain consequences. The FBI argued process. They talked about warrants, jurisdiction, federal priority. The captain listened, then shook his head. This wasn't about paperwork. This was about timing. Removing Bumpy Johnson in this moment would not end crime. It would fracture it. Rival crews would move in within hours. Italians, independents, desperate men looking for territory. Informants would vanish overnight. Lines of communication would burn, and the streets would light up before sunrise. The captain didn't need to threaten this outcome. Everyone there already knew it. Another police car pulled in, then another. Uniforms filled the sidewalks. The message was clear and unmistakable. This arrest would not be clean. It would not be quiet. And it would not be contained. Inside the building, Bumpy Johnson sat exactly where he was. He did not pack a bag. He did not look for exits. He did not call anyone. He understood something that years in Harlem had taught him. Power does not belong to the man with the badge alone. It belongs to the man who controls what happens next. The FBI team felt time slipping away. Every minute increased the risk. Every extra unit changed the equation. One agent finally asked the question that cut through everything. What happens if we proceed anyway? The answer came without emotion. Then tomorrow you will need more men than you brought tonight. You will spend more money than planned. And you still will not control this neighborhood. That was not a threat. It was a forecast. And the FBI was trained to respect forecasts. They scanned the scene again. Police everywhere. Streets sealed. The city standing quietly in the way. At that moment, the agents understood something deeply unsettling. This operation had already failed. Not because Bumpy escaped. Not because the evidence was weak. But because the city had already decided. For now, Bumpy Johnson was more useful free than arrested. The decision was never announced out loud. It didn't need to be. Everyone on that street felt it the moment the FBI agents stopped pushing and started thinking. Their voices lowered. Their movement slowed. The energy changed. This was no longer an arrest in progress. It was a calculation. And calculation meant doubt. The police captain noticed it immediately. He had seen this shift before. Not when criminals panic, but when institutions hesitate. The FBI agents stepped aside to talk among themselves. Radios pressed close to their mouths. Short sentences, no emotions, just options and consequences. Around them, Harlem kept moving. People walked past the street corners. Store lights stayed on. Cars passed slowly. Nothing looked dramatic, and that was exactly the problem. The city was calm, too calm. Everyone involved understood how fragile that calm was. One wrong move, one sudden arrest, and the balance would collapse. The FBI knew how to win cases. They did not know how to control what came after. That was the part the police had been warning them about from the start. Inside the building, Bumpy Johnson finally stood up. Not in fear, not in a rush. He moved slowly, like a man listening to time instead of sound. He poured himself a drink and waited. He didn't need to look outside. He didn't need a call. He understood silence. Silence meant no boots on the stairs, no breach, no chaos. That silence told him the city had stepped in. This was not his first standoff. It was simply another moment where larger forces argued over whether he was more dangerous, inside a cell or walking free. Outside, the FBI received a call that would never appear in any report. It was careful, vague. No names were spoken. No orders were given, just reminders. About public reaction. About budgets, about headlines, about what happens when federal action creates a local disaster. No one said Bumpy Johnson's name, but no one needed to. The agents listened. When the call ended, they already knew the outcome. They walked back to the police captain. Their posture had changed. Less rigid, less certain. One of them said they needed more time. More review, more coordination. It sounded procedural, it sounded professional, but everyone there understood what it meant. The operation was being paused, not canceled, just removed from the night. The captain nodded. He didn't smile. This wasn't a victory. It was damage control. Police cars slowly repositioned. Streets that had been sealed reopened. Engines shut off. The pressure eased. The city exhaled. The FBI packed their files back into cars they never planned to leave unused. As they did, something settled in their minds, uncomfortable and hard to ignore. They had not been stopped by criminals. They had not been threatened. They had not been outgunned. They had been overridden by reality, by a system that chose stability over enforcement when enforcement would cause a war. Inside, Bumpy Johnson finished his drink and sat back down. He didn't celebrate. He didn't smile. He knew this wasn't a win. It was maintenance. Power didn't survive on victories. It survived on timing. He also knew the FBI would return one day, better prepared, more patient. But tonight belonged to the city, and the city had decided that removing him now would cost too much. As the last federal car pulled away, Harlem returned to its usual rhythm. Most people never knew how close the night came to changing everything. They didn't know that for a few quiet hours. The future of the neighborhood had been discussed in whispers, and they would never know that the decision was made not by law, but by consequence. The night ended quietly, but its consequences did not. For the FBI, this was not just a delayed arrest. It was a message they would never acknowledge publicly, but one they understood very clearly. In one neighborhood of New York City, federal authority had limits, not because the law was weak, but because the reality on the ground was stronger. Harlem did not operate on paper. It operated on balance, and that balance had a name. In the days that followed, reports were written carefully. Language was chosen with precision. No one mentioned police interference. No one accused the city of obstruction. The operation was described as postponed. Additional intelligence required. Strategic reassessment. Bureaucratic words that hid a simple truth. The FBI had been told to wait, and waiting was not something they accepted easily. Inside the NYPD, there was no celebration either. Officers returned to routine patrols. Commanders avoided questions. Everyone understood the silence was intentional. The less said, the safer everyone remained. This was not a favor to Bumpy Johnson. It was a decision made to protect the city from itself. Harlem without Bumpy was not freedom. It was a vacuum, and vacuums always pull violence into them. Bumpy Johnson felt the change immediately. Not relief, pressure. He knew nights like this created debt, not financial debt, political debt, the kind that stays invisible until it is collected. He understood that the police had not saved him out of loyalty. They had saved the system, and systems always demand payment in the end. That knowledge kept him cautious, quieter, more controlled. He knew eyes were closer now. Patience had limits. For the FBI, the pause became a problem. Every week that passed made the case more complicated. Informants grew nervous. Stories changed. Some stopped answering calls entirely. The longer Bumpy stayed free, the more protected he became. Not officially, practically, the Bureau began to realize that arresting him would require more than evidence. It would require permission, and that was an idea they hated. Tension grew between federal agents and city officials. Meetings became colder. Cooperation slowed. Files moved more slowly across desks. No one said the reason out loud, but everyone knew. There was a man walking free in Harlem who represented a line the city refused to cross, not because he was untouchable, but because touching him would break something larger. Bumpy continued his life carefully. He avoided unnecessary noise. He limited meetings. He stayed visible enough to remind people he was present, but quiet enough to avoid provoking response. This was not fear, it was discipline. He understood timing better than most men understood power, and timing, more than strength, had kept him alive. What the public never saw was the quiet resentment growing behind closed doors. The FBI did not forget that night. They cataloged it, studied it, learned from it. They began building a different approach. Slower, deeper, less visible. They stopped asking permission from the city and started preparing for a moment when the city would no longer be able to say no, because the truth was simple. The balance that protected Bumpy could not last forever. Harlem was changing. Politics were shifting. Pressure was building from every direction. And everyone involved understood one thing. That night had only delayed the outcome. It had not erased it. The question was no longer if the FBI would come back for Bumpy Johnson. The question was when, and what the city would be willing to sacrifice when they did. Years later, people would argue about what really kept Bumpy Johnson free that night. Some would say corruption. Others would say fear. But those explanations were too simple. The truth was harder to accept. The city did not protect Bumpy because he was powerful. It protected him because removing him at the wrong time would have been more dangerous than leaving him alone. That was the part no official report ever captured. For the FBI, this realization changed everything. They stopped seeing Harlem as just another jurisdiction. They began to understand it as a system with its own internal logic. Arrests did not automatically create order. Sometimes they destroyed it. That understanding did not make the Bureau softer. It made them colder, more patient. They learned that force was not always the first move. Timing was. Bumpy Johnson lived with that knowledge every day after. He knew the protection he received was conditional. It could disappear the moment the balance shifted. He watched the streets closely. He watched the city even closer. He understood that power never announces when it is about to leave. It simply stops answering calls. And when that happens, even the most connected man stands alone. The city, for its part, never admitted what it had done. Officials spoke about law and order, about cooperation and process, but on the ground, officers knew the truth. That night had not been about justice. It had been about control, about preventing something worse, about choosing the least destructive option in a situation where every option was bad. What makes this story uncomfortable is not that a criminal avoided arrest. It is that the system worked exactly as intended, not to eliminate crime, but to manage it, to contain it, to keep it from spilling into places where it could no longer be controlled. Harlem stayed quiet, not because the law won, but because the law paused. Eventually, the balance did break. It always does. Time changes cities. Power shifts. New pressures replace old ones. Bumpy Johnson would not outrun that forever. No one does, but on that night, the outcome was decided before a single door was kicked in. It was decided in parked cars, quiet calls, and calculations about consequences. The FBI never forgot that moment. They adjusted. They waited. And when they finally moved again, they made sure the city could no longer say no. That is how systems correct themselves. Slowly, quietly, without drama. And that is why this story matters. Not because it shows a man who beat the law, but because it shows how close the law came to choosing chaos instead of order, and how, for one night, it chose restraint. Because sometimes the most powerful decision is not the one you make loudly. It is the one you make and never admit.